So as I said, we are going to talk on this topic of firm foundation. Firm foundation. And to start on this topic, I want to start by this verse that we have quoted many times. I'm sure, you have heard this verse many times. But I want to look at it as I relate to Daniel's early life and foundation. Daniel's early life. Train up a child in the way he should go. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. It's a very familiar text, and it's a text that we have used many times. The whole idea that you find from that is the training has to come early. The training has to come early. And I'm sure as parents, most of us, we want the best for our children, if not all of us. We want the best for our children. And sometimes a lot of things are happening in this world. There are a lot of other things that are happening that might not afford us the time. But Ellen G. White writes, relating to this verse, she writes that in the highest sense, the work of education, listen to this, the work of education and the work of redemption are one. I want this to sink a little bit. The work of education and the work of redemption are one. It means what we are being educated is important. If we are going to think about redemption, as we think about our Jesus coming very soon, I think it's almost on everyone's mind that, sometimes we get into a situation where we just say, even now come Lord Jesus. But sometimes we see things happening and we just say, the writing is on the wall. Jesus is coming very soon. And as we educate our children, and as we would want to come to go to heaven with our children, that redemption that we are saying is near, as the work of educating is equated here as one with redemption. Now, we live in busy lives. It's no secret that we are in one of the most expensive cities in the world. It's no secret that we have to work extra hard to survive around here. It's no secret that we are busy. As we are busy with work and work and work, it leaves very little time for us to train up a child. It leaves very little time to train up a child in the way that they should go. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm naive to the fact that Christian education is expensive. No, I'm not naive to that. I had 3 children at one time at DLX school, and it was not cheap. And as one graduated, she went to Birmingham. So I had now 2 at DLX and 1 at Birmingham. So Christian education is not cheap. But is it worth it? So I don't want you to think that, when I'm saying, let's try by all means to take our children through the education of the Christian education. I'm not saying that I don't understand that it is expensive. But I want to tell you that it has its advantages. And I don't want you also to think that I'm saying taking your children to Christian education means that the devil is now saying, that one, I'm done with them. No. There are going to be challenges. But our Bible still says, train up a child. We need to train them when they are young. We need to do the best that we can. Now, as I said, I will use some other research that I found. And this is a research that was done in 2013 by Bengstone and Putney. This is out of the Oxford University. They said children, when they go through religious training or in a Christian education, they say they have what they call sustained faith. Sustained faith. They say early religious training often leads to sustained religious belief and practice into adulthood. One of the things that is clear is we are missing our young people in our churches. But that doesn't mean that what you imparted in them is gone. It doesn't mean that it is gone to waste. The Bible says, train up a child in the way that you want them to grow so that when they are old, they might not depart. The hope is, even if they depart for a while, even if something along the way happens, they will come back. The hope is, but if you did not build that foundation, when they depart, they are gone. Then they need to find themselves. I'm sure amongst us here, there is a big number of us who came to Jesus at a later age. And a lot of those who have that experience, you are like, I wish I had known about this earlier. But you and me, we have the opportunity to take our children, our grandchildren, in through this Christian education right now. So that we are not talking about later on, because we don't know what the world has for our children tomorrow or years from now. Daniel, when you think about talking about someone who had some courage, who had an experience, who is Daniel? In the Adventist church, most of the times when we open the book of Daniel, we are going to talk about prophecy, right? We start from chapter 7, going to the end of Daniel. It's all about the prophecy. That's when we talk about. But today I'm going to concentrate on the first 6 chapters of Daniel. The very first 6 chapters of Daniel, starting with the very first chapter, we learn about the experience of Daniel. We learn about the experience of Daniel. I just chose to talk about Daniel, but there are other characters that we can find in the Bible that were trained at a young age. The whole point that I'm talking about here about education is training at a young age. Training at a young age. Daniel chapter 1 verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart, he made a decision in his heart, that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. He might not defile himself. He made a choice. And this is a young man who is making a choice. The interesting thing about Daniel making this choice is he's in a foreign land. And the Bible is very clear he was a young man. How old was Daniel? 17. Historians who have studied, they say he was about 17 or 18 years of age. And he made a decision. And I'm here to say to you, it's clear that the decision he made was based on what he was taught when he was young. Is the decision Daniel purposed in his heart when we read the Bible, is the decision that he knew he was taught from a young age. And I don't want to say Christian education is the only education. VBS is coming. Bring your children to VBS. There are many ways that we can train up our children. Sabbath school. I talk to Sabbath school teachers all the time, and they're saying parents are coming late with the children to Sabbath school. Bring your children to Sabbath school. When we're talking about Christian education, we're not only talking about taking them there. And by the way, bringing them to Sabbath school is free. So let's bring our children to Sabbath school. Christian education starts at home. And then when they are 17 or 18, we don't know what life is going to take them to. When they are 17 or 18, they might decide, like Rafi, I'm going to University of Alberta. I was speaking to Grandma Kidist, and she was like, I wish he could stay home. But no, he's now a young man. He's going to go to Alberta. And I want to say, Grandma, Mom, you did your part. He was through Deer Lake. And we hope he learned what he learned from there. I'm seeing my young man, Michael, he went all the way to Ohio. And he's back, and you talk to him, he is as respectful as it gets. And I'm saying, Deer Lake must have had a part in bringing you up. Let us not underestimate the power of bringing up our children in the church. The children, they learn a lot. And research has shown that Christian education produces positive behaviors. This is a research that was done by these 2 scholars. And they wrote an article, Religion and Vulnerability Among Low-Risk Adolescents. They write, research has shown that Christian education produces positive behaviors. Research indicates that children who are actively engaged in religious practices often exhibit positive behaviors such as altruism, self-control, and a lower likelihood of engaging in risky behaviors. Christian education. It is that time, when you think about Christian education, you think about, especially when you talk about Daniel, you think about resilience and coping. Another research has shown that religious faith can provide children with framework for understanding and coping with life's challenges. And I want to tell you, there are going to be challenges in the world. There are challenges in this world. How are we going to cope with these challenges? How are our children going to cope with these challenges? And our religious faith can help us. And I'm not saying you have to outsource bringing up your children to Christian education. I'm saying Christian education, these children, they spend more time at school than you spend with them at home when they're in school. Because you are at work, you come, you meet for a little while, and you go to sleep, and then the next day they are at work. What is the influence that they are getting? And sometimes it requires some sacrifice. It requires some sacrifice for you to take your children to Christian education. And maybe it's worth it. So we need to have the resilience that the children need to have the resilience. They need to cope. And in these days of social media, we need to even think harder about where we take our children, especially when they are younger. Because if you don't teach them at home, social media is there to teach them. And what are they being taught? I'm thinking in my own head that Daniel, at the age of 17, he had received the foundation. He had that firm foundation that nothing was able to move him. Nothing was in his way when it came to the world. Because Daniel, one of the things that I've heard, some of the critics that have come about Christian education is, you don't want to raise your children in a protected environment, because sooner or later, they are going to go into the world. And I'm telling you, yes, sooner or later, they're going to go into the world. But even if you look at nature, the way nature is, I've had an opportunity to look at a bird when it was taking care of the little chicks in there. They are not let into the world just like that. They are protected. So Christian education brings that other layer of protection before your children are let out into the world. Sooner or later, they're going to go into the world. But I'm saying, why not protect them before they are out there in the world? Social media is teaching a whole lot of things. But now, let me look at what happens. Academic excellence. I've also heard that the critic, and I want to tell you, Mr. Mtatiro here, he was a teacher at DLX school. He can testify that they don't have the best of the science lab. Yes. They don't have the best of all the stuff that they need. Yes, but what I can tell you is academic excellency and God's favor is also found in Christian education. Down the road from my house, there is a high school. It is a paperless high school. It was built like 3 years ago. So my children could be going into the most advanced high school there is, but I choose to take them to a Christian education. So what I'm saying here is, as you read here from Daniel chapter 1, verse 16, verse 17, it says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Christian education does not separate us from worldly knowledge. It does not mean that when you take your children to Christian education, they are going to be learning the Bible throughout the day. That's not what that means. They are going to integrate the knowledge of this world with the divine wisdom. That's the only difference. By seeking education that harmonizes academic excellence with spiritual growth, we achieve a higher standard. that reflects God's character. I'm here to just tell you that we need our children to keep on understanding God's character, whether they are at school or whether they are at home, because it pays to take your children to Christian education. Because sooner or later they're going to grow. You're not going to be with them. And we have busy lives. We don't have the time to be with them all the time. And I'm telling you, let's do our best as parents. Let's do our best as a church. You know, our church is a constituent church. So for those whom you are graduating from DLX school, they have a discounted price because our church is contributing. So as members, this is the 13th Sabbath. If you have not given your offering, let's give more, because that money also supports Christian education. Think about it. If you have grandchildren, if you have some neighbors who are thinking about where can they send their children, advise them Christian education. Now, academic achievement. This is a research that was done. This article was written for the Journal of Adventist Education in 2018. But a research was done for about 10 years. But the research showed that students in Adventist schools mostly perform above average in standardized tests compared to national averages. Yes, they might not be the best, but they are above the average. Christian education. So what am I saying here? I'm saying if you take your child to Christian education, you are not going to lower their academic potential. You are not going to lower their academic potential. Okay, so let me move on here to speak about, the story that we are all familiar with. The story that we find in Daniel chapter 6. This is a very interesting story that we find and we have read and we have studied many times. And we find this story in Daniel chapter 6. The story of Daniel in the lion's den. There are two lessons that I want to touch here. One is facing trials with faith. Facing trials with faith. And the other lesson that I want is influence in a foreign land. So let's look here. The power of prayer. When we read in Daniel chapter, chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. I will read here in your hearing. Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom. Since when? Since early days. I want you to understand since early days. This is Daniel. In chapter 6, Daniel is no longer a teenager. This is now a new king. We now have King Darius. We now have King Darius, who is now ruling. Darius has taken over from King Nebuchadnezzar, who was ruling. And now King Darius is saying, King Darius, when you read your Bible very clearly, it shows that King Darius had faith in God. King Darius, for some reason, he had some faith. Maybe he had seen what had happened to his father, Nebuchadnezzar. He had faith in God. But the people who were around him did not like Daniel. Did not like Daniel. So they went to King Nebuchadnezzar, to King Darius, and said, you need to put a decree. And he was tricked. I would say as a king, he was not supposed to be tricked like that. He was tricked to put this. But my Bible tells me, when I read here, it says in verse 14, and the king, when he heard these words, this is when the people came to report that there is someone who is praying. You are not supposed to pray to anyone else, and everyone has to pray only to you, King Darius. But then when these people saw that Daniel was praying to his God, when you are praying. I'm sure Daniel's prayer was silent. No one heard, even if he was loud. He was in his room. But I don't know if they heard. But they concluded that the fact that he is praying and is kneeling down, he is praying to God. That was their conclusion. That was their conclusion. And then they went and said, you know what? These 30 days, before the 30 days, I'm sure it was like the first day that they noticed that. because they wanted something to catch Daniel doing. They went to the king and says, King, we found that Daniel is praying to his God. He's going against your decree. And then verse 14 says, and the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. You put a decree, and now you want to deliver him? How do you do that? But he had put a decree according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians. And you can't change that according to the laws. So the Medes and the Persians, the decree or statute could not be changed. But he is troubled. My Bible tells me in verse 16, so the king gave command that they brought Daniel, and we know the story. Daniel was brought, and Daniel was thrown into the den of lions. An interesting story. But here, listen to this on verse 16. To show that this King Darius was a little different. But he still carried through with what he had done. But in verse 16 it says, towards the end, but the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. You talk of influence. The king is throwing Daniel into the lion's den. And the king himself is saying, I know, I signed this. I did not anticipate that this law was going to catch you. I did not understand that these people were tricking me. But I know what Daniel, even if Daniel had some doubts, even the king is strengthening him. You talk of an influence. The king says, I know the king that you pray. I know that you pray to the God of heaven. I know that God. I might not be worshiping him, but I know the king the God that you worship is going to deliver you. When you talk about influence and witnessing in a foreign land, that was at its peak. That's Daniel. Daniel is like, I know. This is now our young people who are now going to college. The influence that we have taught them. Max, I know you're going to go to UBC. Max, our pianist, the guy is talented. And as you go to UBC, I want those people, those professors, to understand that you are different. I want them to understand that the God that you worship is a different God. I want them to understand that, these people might be going against you, but your God is going to deliver you. King Darius then said in verse 26, the story goes on to say, they throw him into the lion's den. They throw him into the lion's den, and as he was in the lion's den, obviously nothing happened to him. But the king that night, let me read it. Verse 18, now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and he said, I don't want no entertainment. He was fasting. The king was fasting. A non-believing king was fasting for Daniel. You talk of influence. He was fasting. He said, I'm not going to have entertainment tonight. I'm not going to eat. He could not sleep. And the king arose very early, verse 19, in the morning and went hence to the den of lions. Who would expect the lions? Historians say when they were about to do a thing like this, they actually made the lions to fast for a number of days. So they did not give the lions some food for a number of days, so that they are as vicious as it can get. And the king had faith. Do you know that Darius sometimes has got more faith than most of us? What was he expecting to see? But Darius expected to see, because when he got there and when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying, Daniel, servant of the living God, is your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? Who comes to a den of lions that are hungry, have thrown in someone? Daniel, by the way, Daniel was not the first person to be thrown in the lion's den. This was their custom. They would do these things time and time again. So the expectation was he will be eaten before he even touched the ground. But the king had faith that Daniel was alive. He had influenced the king Darius. He might not have been the greatest of kings. He might have had his shortfalls, but the influence of someone who had a firm foundation, we see influencing King Darius. What an influence. And as we read in education, book education, our Ellen White writes, with such an army of workers as our youth rightly trained might furnish, how soon the message of a crucified, risen, and soon coming Savior might be carried to the whole world. Youth, young people, how can we train them? Let's have that foundation. Let's build the firm foundation. Let's make sure that our young people are trained so that when this happens to them, then they will be strong. Christian education prepares us to be witnesses for Christ in every sphere of our lives. Every sphere of our lives, Christian education will help us. Christian education is not cheap, but Christian education pays as well. You know, my Bible tells me that in verse 24, that those people who had tricked the king, their families, their children, and their wives were thrown in the dens of lions. And on that day, the lions, I'm sure they had a buffet. Because the Bible tells me that they were eaten before they even hit the ground. That's what they expected. But Darius made a decree. King Darius made a decree. And the decree said, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. The God of Daniel endures forever, even today. The God of Daniel is the God that can build the firm foundation. The God of Daniel is here for you and me. Now, thank you, Belize, for reading that text. That text is why Jesus is talking about firm foundation. In the context of education today, I want to challenge you that may we build a firm foundation for our young people. Jesus said, therefore, whoever hears these words, these sayings of mine, and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. My brothers and sisters, I want to say to you, Christian education is a firm foundation. Because when these children leave our comfortable nest, they are going to go into the world. Rain is going to descend on them. Are they going to remain firm? There's going to be wind and floods of this life. Are they going to be firm? There's going to be the house, they're going to be beat like a flood that is beating against their house. Are they going to remain firm? May we build a firm foundation. There's a positive peer and adult relationships in our Christian education. And specifically, I want to promote our Adventist education. The supportive community in Adventist schools, including relationships with peers and mentors, provides a network of support that helps children cope with difficulties. And yes, difficulties are going to come. There are going to be difficulties. And now some of you are like, you are talking about children. I don't have children that are going to school. But I want to tell you, there's an African proverb that says, it takes a village to raise a child. And you are the village when it comes to the Christian education. You might not have your biological child here, might not have a grandchild here, but I'm telling you, these children that you see running around the church, they are depending on you to help them on this journey of life. We are a community, and in this community, may we all stand firm together to build our children. May we help each other. You might not be able to go and pay for someone to go to DLEG, but you might be able to come and volunteer for VBS coming next week. You might not have the resources to do something, but you might have a neighbor who has a child that needs, and you might be the person who might influence that neighbor. I want to tell you, our children need us today more than they ever needed us. We are in a different world. They are being influenced by many winds that are blowing. And I'm saying, you and me, we have a duty to play. Let's play our duty in raising these children. these children in our church, they depend on us. Let's build them. Let's build the firm foundation. Our musicians coming as we close right now. I just want to tell you that it's never too late for us to start coming together. It's never too late for us to come together, to build together, to make sure that these children that are with us in this church have a firm foundation. May God add a blessing to the reading of His word.